Hello, I'm Catty Kay in Washington. David Eads is in London. The Queen has approved the Prime Minister's decision to suspend the British Parliament just days after it returns from recess next week. The move significantly limits the parliamentary time that MPs now have to pass laws stopping a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October, as just yesterday opposition leaders had said was their plan.
Well, critics of the government are calling it a constitutional outrage, but ministers maintain the suspension is normal practice ahead of a Queen's speech. The Prime Minister has denied that the move was intended to force through a no deal, insisting instead that it is necessary to start a fresh parliamentary session in which his government can set out its new plans.
There will be ample time on both sides of that crucial October the 17th summit, ample time in Parliament for MPs to debate the EU, to debate Brexit and all the other issues. Ample time.
The leader of the opposition, Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, says that the first thing MPs will do when they return to the Commons next Tuesday is attempt to pass a law opposing this suspension, followed by a vote of no confidence.
This is an attempt by a Prime Minister who was elected by a very small number of people in the country as the Conservative Party membership to ride roughshod over Parliament and prevent any legislation or debate that would stop this country leaving the EU without a deal.
Well, prorogation is the formal term for suspending Parliament. It means bringing all business, that's debates, legislation, votes as well, to a halt. The move considerably reduces the amount of parliamentary time available then for MPs before the current Brexit date. Under old plans, Parliament was set to sit for 6 weeks between next Tuesday and the end of October.
But Parliament will now close for business earlier, not reopening until October the 14th, and MPs will be unable to pass any legislation in the interim. It gives Parliament even less time to try to stop no deal before Britain's scheduled leaving date of October the 31st. Joining us now from Westminster is Whitehall correspondent for the Financial Times, Sebastian Payne. Sebastian, thanks very much for joining us. The biggest impact of the Prime Minister's decision today?
Well, I think the reaction is the biggest impact, that obviously prorogation happens all the time. The parliamentary sessions come to the end. There's normally about a week before one session begins and another starts. This is the longest prorogation, a suspension of Parliament since 1945. So a lot of people are seeing this as some kind of outrage. And one of those people is the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, who's currently sunning himself in a much nicer climate, and said he hadn't been informed by the government of this at all, and said it was clearly an attempt by Mr Johnson to stop MPs from debating the consequences of Brexit with or without a deal. But in response, Mr Johnson has said that this is just his way of putting forward a new legislative programme. But what's really going on here is that Downing Street is very keen to stop MPs from having time to debate and try and stop his Brexit strategy, because they don't want a no-deal Brexit, whereas his strategy is to keep that no-deal Brexit on the table in an effort to force a deal at the next EU Council, which is due on the 17th of October. So people in Downing Street are saying, in fact, this gives us a perfect landing zone to still get a Brexit deal, because Parliament won't be able to stop a no-deal, which will create maximum pressure on the EU when we come to that Council. But that's not going to keep many people happy who see this as Mr Johnson trying to subvert the will of Parliament.
No, and we wonder what the sort of chain reaction is going to be within Parliament still to come, Sebastian. But I think it's fair to say, for all the hand-wringing and shaking of heads, Boris Johnson had pointed towards this previously, hadn't he? This hasn't come completely out of the blue.
Know that I was with Mr Johnson at the G7 this weekend in Biarritz, and he was consistently asked, would you prorogue Parliament or shut it down? And he said that he's not really wasn't so keen on these arcane devices, but he never ruled it out. So we all knew that this was a possibility. And the line from number 10 has been is that politicians don't get to choose the public votes they respect, and that's a reference to the 2016 referendum. Boris Johnson sees that as the crucial mandate, and if that avoids shutting down Parliament, well, that's what he's very much willing to do. But as you were just saying, the question is what's going to happen when Parliament returns next Tuesday as planned, because MPs were already hoping to get legislation into law that would force him to have a Brexit delay. But now the ante has very much been upped since his decision.
Hasn't it ever?
So the timetable perhaps for a vote of no confidence moving up a little bit. Sebastian Payne, thanks very much for joining us. Let's just show you how some members of the UK public have been reacting to the government's decision to suspend Parliament. This is an official online petition which anyone can sign via the UK's Parliament's website. So far, there are 664,168 signatures and counting. Every 10 seconds, this updates, and there you go, you just saw it updating in real time. Its main demand is that Parliament must not be prorogued or suspended unless and until the Article 50 period has been sufficiently extended or the UK's intention to withdraw from the EU has been cancelled.
Yeah, basically for or against that idea. These are all against proroguing. The numbers rising all the time. Actually, Cathy and I have both made a guess as to what it's going to be before the end of the programme. We won't tell you now. We will review this, though, just to get a sense as to how fast that is rising. If you get more than 100,000 signatures, you can have a debate. You're well on that way there. You've got 665,000 already. Right, we're going to head over to Derby now because we can speak to the Conservative MP Pauline Latham, who is a member of the pro-Brexit European Research Group. Pauline, thanks very much for joining us. I just wonder if I could start with this, really. I don't quite understand why the government doesn't just come clean and say, yes, this is to restrict time for debates and efforts once again to block the leaving date of October the 31st, because it's pretty transparent, isn't it?
No, because we need a Queen's speech. We had a Queen's speech for Theresa May and her legislative programme. We haven't had one for Boris Johnson, and we need one. And we've heard the media talking all day about us not being there for weeks and weeks and weeks. We weren't going to be there for 3 to 4 weeks anyway because of the conference recess. This is just 3 or 4 days in addition to that.
Well, it's certainly got everyone going, hasn't it? And it does raise the prospect, yes. It's a risky prospect perhaps, of a vote of no confidence, or indeed still of those MPs opposed to that 31st of October no deal Brexit, still managing to somehow pull together legislation to block it.
But we don't know that there will be no deal. Boris Johnson is trying very hard to get a deal, and that's what all of us really want. It has to be the right deal, I agree. And if he doesn't get a deal that's satisfactory for Parliament, we will debate no deal. We will debate a deal if he gets one. And there is time for that after the Queen's speech.
Ms Latham, what's the Prime Minister afraid of? If he thinks he's got such a good plan and such a good strategy, why not have Parliament debate it for as long as possible, before October the 31st? I mean, you mentioned that it was going to be out of session anyway, but there was some moves amongst parliamentarians to cancel the recess, and so they would have actually added an extra 3 weeks or so to the timetable.
You'd have to cancel the three-party conferences, and that's never going to happen. But he's not afraid of anything. He needs his own legislative programme. But we can't debate anything until we know what we're debating. He hasn't got the deal yet, and that isn't going to happen until the 16th or 17th of October. So what are we supposed to do? Sit in Parliament kicking our heels? We've been doing that for several months when we haven't really been legislating. We've been weeks and weeks and weeks not voting on anything. So we need things to vote on. We need to go into Parliament to debate them. And yes, once Boris Johnson gets a deal, he will bring it to Parliament and we will discuss it. But he can't bring it to Parliament till he's got it.
I mean, you would concede that this is unusual. It is a long period of time for Parliament to be prorogued at a period of intense national interest, crisis that the country is going through. To the extent that democracy is made up not just of rules, but of customs and norms as well, do you have any concerns at all about riding roughshod over some of those customs and norms?
Well, I have concerns that some people are trying to ride roughshod over the referendum result, but we do always have a prorogation prior to the Queen's speech, and that's what this is.
So, would you be quite happy to say at this point, I think Boris Johnson pretty much said it, that there should be ample time nonetheless for a debate for MPs in Parliament before we get to October the 31st?
Well, you may have noticed that over the last 3 years we have had days and days
and days I know we've
of
had that,
discussion.
but I'm asking that for
yes,
before we get to the 31st of October.
Yes, but once he's got a deal, there will be something for us to discuss. We've debated no deal. We haven't got no deal, we haven't got a deal at the moment. Once he gets a deal, if he gets a deal, we will have ample time after the Queen's speech to debate in Parliament, and it'll be the same people saying the same thing, which is what's been happening for 3 years. But if he's got a deal, we'll be able to discuss the realities of what we're going to do once we've left Europe.
OK, Pauline Latham, thank you very much for joining us. Joining us now is Labour MP for Oxford East, Annalise Dodds. Ms Dodds, thank you very much for joining us. In a sense, the Prime Minister has called the bluff of the opposition, hasn't he, by moving up the timetable potentially for a vote of no confidence, and yet the numbers for voting no confidence in the government may well not be there.
Well, what Boris Johnson has done is unusual to say the least. I mean, many people are actually saying it's pretty undemocratic. I think all of us members of Parliament were expecting that we would be able to come back according to the usual timetable. In fact, many of us expected, given the uncertainty that's been caused by the threat of no deal, that we might be cancelling conference recesses. I would have been more than happy for my party not to have a conference if that meant that we could actually represent our constituents' concerns about this. Instead, we have this bizarre move that has not occurred before. It's not a usual thing to happen. Now, obviously, I do not have confidence in Boris Johnson. I didn't have confidence in him as a Foreign Secretary, and his behaviour as Prime Minister has just cemented that view. But there isn't a lot of sense in having a no-confidence vote unless it's certain to go through. And where we do have the numbers, I think it's pretty clear across Parliament, is in members of Parliament representing their constituents who overwhelmingly are saying to us, we don't want no deal. It wasn't on the ballot paper. We don't want no deal. We're worried about it. We're frightened about it. We want you to stop that. Parliament's voted time and time again to stop that. And yet we seem to have a Prime Minister who's determined to push it through.
But the question now is going to be how many of those Conservative members of Parliament are actually prepared to cross the aisle and vote with the opposition against their own government. And that is something that's still up to... Even today, you've got Conservative members saying, look, I really don't like what the Prime Minister is doing, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to vote potentially to make Jeremy Corbyn even a caretaker Prime Minister.
But equally, we have heard figures like Philip Hammond, of course, the previous Chancellor, stating that he was deeply concerned about what the current Prime Minister is doing. And, you know, I think actually many of these Conservative MPs will have been contacted. In fact, I'm pretty sure all of them will have been contacted by people like those who have been speaking to me, constituents saying, for example, that they can't get access to the drugs that they used to because of stockpiling with the threat of no deal. Constituents saying they're worried about their jobs if there's a chaotic no deal. Those Conservative MPs hopefully will have been listening to that, and so I hope that many of them will actually represent those concerns and become part of what's now a pretty big cross-party movement of MPs.
Well, it is a cross-party movement of MPs, Annalise, but if it comes to a vote of no confidence and it means finding a caretaker Prime Minister, is it more important for you that it is someone who will represent whichever party it might be, whichever leader, than Jeremy Corbyn, who, I mean, at the moment, one would have to suggest he probably wouldn't get the backing? Would you be prepared to go with someone else?
Well, we've been clear that we'll try and use every mechanism to block no deal, and obviously Jeremy has been in talks with the other opposition leaders. He was doing that yesterday. As I understand, they were very, very productive talks. I mean, I think our main concern is about the impact of this on the country. It's not about any kind of party management issues. I know that Jeremy is deeply concerned about the prospect of no deal. Obviously, I think he would be by far the most effective leader of any kind of situation that might arise. But our main priority is blocking that chaotic Brexit that would have such a negative impact on people in the country. That's the big priority. OK,
Annalise Dodds in Oxford, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Right, we've got some live pictures, I think, coming in to you here. This is down at Westminster. You can see there is a right old crowd gathered down there. There was talk of a demonstration. They are marching through there. I was there earlier in the afternoon. It was rowdy. It certainly wasn't as, let's say, as an organised demonstration that we've got going on there at the moment, blocking off quite a bit of Westminster and Millbank.
OK, joining us now from northwest France is former Conservative Minister Philip Lee. Mr Lee, thanks very much for joining the programme. You were Justice Minister in Theresa May's government. You resigned over her approach to Brexit, which you considered too hardline. Would you be willing at this juncture to support a vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson's government?
I don't think we're at the vote of no confidence stage in this process. I know the broader public are just wondering when this nonsense is going to end, but I think votes of no confidence are an October phenomenon, not a September one. I continue to believe that there is a way through, a legislative way through in Parliament to stop no deal being forced on a country that doesn't clearly want it. If the country wants it,
way, given that the timetable is now so short.
Well, I bow to colleagues who are the legislative experts, but I'm pretty convinced that there is something that we can do, which explains, I guess, why the government have made the move that they have. It's all within the rules. I'm not going to throw my toys out of a pram. They're trying to get an outcome of forcing either a no deal or putting people like me in a position to vote for a deal that I don't believe is in the best interests of my constituents, with the threat that if I don't, it's going to be no deal. You don't have to be terribly clever. You don't have to sit in a bunker in number 10 to know what this is all about. It's pretty obvious, but I think it falls to parliamentarians, particularly Conservative parliamentarians, who think a no deal is just not in the best interests of our nation, to stand up and be counted next week. And I think if they do, then I think it's going to be an interesting outcome.
That's an interesting point, Philip, you make there. So in a sense, you might even see something positive coming out of what, in other circumstances, you perhaps would find a bit distasteful, this proroguing.
Oh, I mean, look, I'm not surprised by the actions of a pretty ruthless, hard Brexit minority of my parties, backed by operatives who make it well known that they're extremely clever and sharp and going to do this, that and the other. Why am I surprised that they would do this? It certainly hasn't come as a surprise to those Conservatives, myself, Dominic Grieve, Kitto Bebb, who have been warning colleagues for months now that this was the ultimate end game. Well, we're into the end game. They've signalled their intention to force things through and will use any rule and bend it as far as it can in order to secure that outcome, in which case Conservative colleagues in particular, who do not like what is happening, who think that it is wrong and not in their best interest, of the country, they've got a choice to make. It's put up or shut up time next week.
Right. Well, yeah, and your holiday's nearly over now. The work starts again.
I'm sort of looking at myself on the screen thinking, yeah, there's the parliamentarian having a nice time in northwest France.
Well, you're all allowed a holiday at various times, Philip. Thanks, Philip.
I'm very happy to give up my time on this issue because it is hugely important to the future of our country.
Indeed. Philip Lee there in Morlaix in Brittany. Thanks a lot. Well, what is the EU making of all of this? Joining us now from Brussels is our Europe editor, Katja Adler. We're trying to work out what to make of it. Katja, what are they saying over there?
Well, officially, deciding to suspend Parliament and the arguments for or against that at such a pivotal time in UK politics, that's seen by the EU as a domestic matter, and that's why the European Commission, for example, or Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, have refused to comment on it. There have been some comments from inside the European Parliament itself, though. The President of the European Parliament saying that keeping parliaments open and listening to them is good for democracy, while Guy Verhofstadt, who's on the Brexit steering committee there and is known for being very outspoken, he said this was a sinister turn in the Brexit drama, if you like. But I think, if the question is, by taking these actions, has the Prime Minister now made EU leaders sit up and listen, smell the coffee and realise that he is absolutely serious about a no-deal Brexit? Well, then I'd say to you, they already believed that he was serious after his trips last week to Berlin and Paris and his presence at the G7 summit this weekend as well. But that realisation isn't make EU leaders panic and saying we'll compromise now to avoid a no-deal Brexit. Of course, a no-deal Brexit would be damaging for the EU, but when the EU compromises, and it does, it tends to compromise when it's in its own wider interest. And the EU simply thinks that getting rid of that famous Irish backstop guarantee without anything else to replace it, and thereby exposing the whole single market, would be more damaging than that no-deal Brexit. So you remember that refrain of Theresa May's that no no deal is better than a bad deal. Well, the EU agrees with that. That said, at a very low level, cross-channel discussions are taking place as to what alternatives could be.
And I guess that's still the question, right, Katia? The timetable may have been shrunk from those trying to prevent a no-deal Brexit, but in the end it's going to come down to those last 2 or 3 weeks of October and whether the EU side feels that there has been something presented from number 10 that amounts to an acceptable substitute to the backstop. And in the end it will come down to that, won't it?
Well, it will. I mean, but you say 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, that is if you take the Prime Minister at his word that he definitely wants to leave the EU by the 31st of October. But, you know, this is not a man who's always kept his word. I mean, he's repeated often enough that it's very hard to see how he could U-turn on this. But he also said when he became Prime Minister, not only does he want to leave by the 31st of October, but he wants to reunite a very divided United Kingdom, divided over this Brexit issue. If he wanted to, he could perhaps use those divisions as saying, look, we need to go forward in a calmer manner and therefore extend the Brexit process another time. This looks very unlikely at this point. But here on the EU side, those who believe there is a very small window, and I say a small window because the most likely outcome here in EU circles is being seen right now as a no-deal Brexit. Those who see a small window of opportunity say that's got to happen with an extension. If not, it's going to have to be a panic last-minute deal right at the end of October. So nail-biting time once again, and that's not the very first time we've been there, of course, in this Brexit process.
No, I wonder if it will be the last. May well not, you never know. Katia, thank you very much indeed for that. I want to go over to our Westminster studio now because the former advisor to George Osborne, Helen Thomas, is with us. Helen, thanks very much for joining us. I wonder, I mean, with all these ruffled feathers, who's ruffled the most? Perhaps it's Tory MPs so deeply upset about the idea of a no-deal Brexit, and yet they are on the spot now.
They certainly are, and this is, you know, a huge hand grenade to throw into matters just before everybody's coming back from that recess. And I think it is deliberately designed, of course, to do that, to really put the squeeze on each Conservative MP. What is their priority? Do they back Boris Johnson's strategy of do or die, or are they prepared to go against him?
Well, yeah, that is obviously the big challenge. One thing it does do is show how proactive Boris Johnson is. I mean, there must be some who think at least we're getting a blockage cleared here.
Well, that's right. You know, that is why this is so surprising, is obviously under Theresa May we had a couple of years of very reactive kind of leadership where she wanted to go away and think heavily about things and then she would take the risk. This is a proactive leader who seems happy to take these risks and clearly has some kind of plan. Whether all of his MPs will agree with it or not, we are about to find out.
So, Helen, there's been a lot of focus today on whether this jumps up the timetable for a vote of no confidence. But let's say, for the moment, for the sake of argument, that the vote of no confidence passes, that the Labour side manages to get enough MPs pulled over from the Tory side, and they have the support for it. But what happens then? It's not even clear then that Boris Johnson feels he has to step down as Prime Minister, and we could have the election after the 31st of October anyway, couldn't we?
Well, that's the thing about the vote of no confidence that has become clear, actually, over the summer, is that if you are anti-no deal, it does not guarantee avoidance of that. In fact, very little procedurally does actually get rid of no deal. And in fact, that group of people, all they can really hope for is an extension in any case, because, of course, the clock is ticking and we go down towards the wire whenever that date is, and we will leave without a deal if that doesn't happen. So effectively, you know, talk of anti-no deal in itself is rather misleading.
Ooh, well, Helen, thank you very much indeed. It just throws up question after question after question, Katie, doesn't it? Each time you reach a point, you think, all right, now there has to be a decision. They manage to find another ruse or another route to delay it a bit more.
I want a moment of sympathy, though, because I've been asked to go on American television this evening and explain what is going on in Parliament at the moment. You try that one, David.
Some want in, some want out. This is Beyond 100 Days from the BBC.